Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. This is the latest episode of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. And today we're going into the bathtub with one of the real old masters. We're the masters of bathtub reading. We're talking about Nabokov, Vladimir Nabokov, um, the Pale Fire. We're going to take the bull by the horns in the bathtub. Now, I want to say two or three things. One is I'm going to do two or three of these. I've sort of fallen behind in these lectures, and if you notice, I'm wearing the same shirt every lecture. That's simply because I'm doing them all this afternoon. So I do change my shirt almost as much often as I take baths. So you don't need to worry about that. And if the smell, if you're imagining a smell coming out of the YouTube, it's not. It's your imagination. My very fresh, clean shirt. I'm going to do two or three lectures, and I'll probably run them off at different times. Now, Pale Fire is, Nabokov is one of my favorite writers for reading anywhere, particularly in the bathtub. And I think he's misunderstood. I've done a few other lectures, and he's too often taught. And there is much about Nabokov which has invited excessive intellectualizing of his work, nowhere more so than Pale Fire. So let's try to talk about it in context and think about it as a reading experience rather than a studying experience. I'm going to do two or three short lectures on this. Today I just want to talk a little bit about the foreword. The foreword. We talked a bit. I did some lectures out of the bathtub on Lolita and one of my favorite Nabokov novels, Laughter in the Dark. And we talked a lot about the foreword in Nabokov, or the preface. And it is a very important part of Nabokov. There's two or three things that are going to put you off about reading Pale Fire. They certainly put me off when I started reading it. And that is, it presents you with a foreword, and if, like most good readers, whenever you're confronted by a foreword in a novel, you probably skip it. Good, that's a good instinct. But Nabokov is going to screw that instinct up. So when you see a foreword in Nabokov, you have to read it, and it is the novel. All right, that's the other thing. The second thing is it starts with a long poem. The poem called Pale Fire, which is the primary text. A poem in four cantos, which is the poem written by an artist named John Shade, a poet named John Shade, and that shows up. So you have a preface, and then you have a long poem. Now, most of us who read novels are going to want to just skip them immediately. You can't do this. You cannot do this. If you don't like to read poems, I understand that, but you have to read Pale Fire because A, it's a wonderful poem. It's a beautiful poem, and you need to read it without any of the commentary. Okay? So don't make the mistake that I'm sure I made when I was 17 or 18, where you kind of skim through the poem to get to the meat of the book, which is this long commentary on the poem, which is a joke commentary because a story emerges from the commentary. You must read Pale Fire, the poem, without knowing any commentary. It's very important. Just like you must read the preface without knowing what the book is about. Now, what Nabokov always does in all his books, we talked about this with Lolita, is he does require you to reread his book several times. All right, you're not going to. You may think you don't want to read it several times. You may just want to read a book once, but when you finish the book, he's almost certainly sending you back to the beginning. Now, there's no way you can avoid this in many ways. So what I want to do with these lectures is to try experiment a bit, which is we're going to start and we're going to read through Pale Fire, the preface, the poem, and then the commentary, three separate lectures. And then I thought what we would do is do something I normally never do, which is look at a significant book about Pale Fire. And Brian Boyd is the expert. He lived with the Nabokovs, and he worked with them, and he wrote a 2-volume biography of Nabokov, and he's the expert on everything Nabokovian. And this is really one volume, which I've never read all the way through, but it basically is going to tell you, it's going to be the commentary on the commentary of Pale Fire. Now, normally I'll never read one of these books in these bathtubs discussions, But we want to do it sort of as an experiment, because what Nabokov is asking you to do at the beginning of his book, and remember who's asking him. Nabokov is not asking you to do this. The critic who puts together this fictional book is asking you to do it. He's asking you to look at the commentary on the book and the book simultaneously. Okay, Charles Kinbote is the critic who's writing the preface to Pale Fire and the commentary on Pale Fire. And he wants you to look at the commentary and the book and put them on the table next to each other and go back and forth. Okay? So he's asking you to go to, look at line 43. Okay, I go to line 43, and now I read the commentary. And this is what every bad academic asks you to do, to turn the book into a reflection on the commentary, which is a reflection on the book. Right? We are not going to do that. We're going to put this off, and we're going to talk about that in a few weeks. And we're just going to move into the joyous perplexity of reading this great novel. And in order to do that, we must look at it as a novel which is structured like a forward poem, commentary on the poem, but which is very much a novel. It starts off and it calls itself a foreword, but what this really is like the preface to Lolita. It is the frame narrative to the book. So a frame narrative is sort of like, the story that happens later when we look at the book in context of the frame. The most famous frame narrative is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, all the pilgrims. It starts off the frame narrative, all the pilgrims go off on a trip, and then they stop, and they each tell a story, and they move forward, and then at the end of the frame narrative, if Chaucer had lived, you would conclude their pilgrimage. The other types of frame narrative are frame narratives in the context of a novel. Here's the simplest frame narrative. J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye begins with the frame is Holden in a hospital because he's had a breakdown, and he's talking to the doctor. And he's talking to the doctor, and he's telling him about his brother and the things that happened to him, the crazy business that happened to him recently. The frame is starting in the hospital and then at the end coming out of the hospital. So there's your frame narrative. It happens afterwards. So we hear the story in context of it being reflected upon. Some novels don't do that. Brian Moore, who rarely does the frame narrative. We start at the beginning of the novel, we end at the end of the novel. There's real dangers with the frame narrative. But for Nabokov, it's a perfectly necessary type of opening. So we got to think about this opening not as a foreword. It's not setting us up for the novel. It is setting us up for the context of the novel. The context of the novel is that the critic, Charles Kinbote, Kinbote, there's a lot of puns in the Nabokov, and you can play with that name quite a bit. And again, as usual, excuse me for making mistakes. I'll make lots of mistakes. But I'm rereading it again now. Yeah, Charles Kinbote. I won't always get everything right. Is writing a preface. Now, you don't need the information of it. What you have to really start to do is realize that it starts off talking about a Pale Fire, a poem in heroic couplets of 999 lines. And there's a bits of information about the poem that we get from this academic named Charles Kinbote. It's 999 lines, and the poet was about to complete the poem, the 1,000th line, when he dies. We don't know why yet, but he dies. Okay. It's taking place in New Y, Appalachia, USA. More puns. We have a critic explaining what happened, and they're in New Y. There's tons of these. When you see these, you're seeing that Nabokov is putting you into a situation where someone's writing a story around you, and you have to immediately, as soon as you see New Y, there's a game going on here. And you're the object of the game. So there's a story going on, and you're the object of it. Now, he starts to tell you about this New Y, how this manuscript was composed, and how John Shade composed this long poem. And we get all this stuff, basically, that many academic textual introductions do. They give us all the information, the number of lines, and what kind of couplets they are, blah, blah, blah. And in the course of it, nothing about the poem itself or what the poem is about is even mentioned. It's really important. It's really one of the reasons why the greatest part of this book is this poem, which no one reads except you. So you can't skip the poem. So there's a lot of stuff by this asshole. And you got to remember that most of Nabokov's central characters are assholes. They're almost all complete assholes. Now that's whether it's Humbert Humbert or it's the loser movie critic in Laughter in the Dark. There's a lot of these assholes running around as the central characters of his novels. This is a book in which the central character is really Charles Kinbote, who's the critic, who's trying to explain to you this 999-line poem called Pale Fire. And in the course of telling you this story, we have this poem in the middle of it, which is actually a wonderful poem written by a fictional character named John Shade, who is actually a really, really interesting character. He's the one that's most difficult to see, but he's a very moving character. He's a very likable character. He's a very powerful and artistic character. And he's one of the few heroes I can think of in a Nabokov novel. He's somebody you really genuinely are going to like, I think. Okay. Now, we have this setup, and what we're learning in this opening foreword is we're at the end of the story. So the poem has been written. Kinbote, Shade is dead, and the manuscript is put together by Charles Kinbote, who is using the manuscript. He's wrested it. He's pulled it out of the house of Shade just as he died, and kept it from the wife, and kept it from everybody, has made it his own property because he's so obsessed with this poet who lived next door to him that he wants to make it his. He wants to make it his by providing this long commentary on the poem. Okay, so that's how we get into it. Now, the opening is going to have all of this, so all of this material is going on. And we have this setup about, we learn eventually as we go through it that Kinbote has been, Shade has been killed, has been murdered. And we have this kind of story about how Kinbote is going to get this book published. Now, in the course of the foreword, we also hear a little bit about the first meeting between Kinbote and John Shade when they first work at this university together. And in the course of working this university together, we learn a few things about Kinbote. One is that nobody likes him. Nobody likes this guy. He's a creep. He's also gay. Now that's I don't think that Nabokov dislikes gay people, but he does have a couple of his more unsavory characters are gay, not simply because they're gays that makes them unsavory, but that they actually are totally dishonest about their presentation in life. So there's something dishonest about this character from the beginning. He's particularly having affairs with his students and trying to get involved with his characters, his students, and with his roommates, with boys he rents a room to. And we learn this about him. And we also learn that he really doesn't like women. So he gives you a few quotes in here about how much about how people say that he hates women, and that he has a real egomaniacal nature. So we're learning in the opening chapter about a relationship, the relationship between Kinbote and John Shade. This is much more important than any of that couplet stuff. The character of Kinbote, who is very much a Humbert Humbert. He sees Lolita and he wants to make her part of his fantasy in the same way that Kinbote wants to make Shade and his poem part of his fantasy. And then we come to the end of the foreword, which is really the notion that I think in the last paragraph of the foreword is very interesting, that his fascination with Kinbote, with John Shade, is that he can take the real life that he lives and transform it into a work of art which is not the real life that he lives. Everything that Nabokov does is that. He uses material from life, physical material, emotional material. He does it really well, particularly from his life. This is a very personal book. You see a lot of personal qualities in this, in the relationship between John Shade and his wife and their daughter. Nabokov and his wife and their son were a very close trio, a real close triumvirate of characters. And that relationship, that tightness of that relationship is very much the story of Pale Fire, the poem. So we learn those. That is what the foreword is about. The foreword is not about a commentary on the poem. It's about that relationship that's been set in motion, and that at the end of the relationship, at the end of the story, Kinbote has published his version of Pale Fire, which is what we hold in our hands. Okay, so that's enough for the foreword today. I want to come back tomorrow and talk about the poem itself, Pale Fire. It's a beautiful book. So read this as the opening chapter of a novel, the foreword. Very important. All right? Okay, good luck. This is one of the great books. You should really enjoy this. And, don't worry about the commentary stuff. Really focus on the relationships between Kinbote and the people in the university who don't like him, okay, who will keep popping up. All right, bye.